Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 terrifying Russian weapons of war. Between a post-World War II habit of exaggerating the military prowess of the Third Reich, the amazing performances of Finnish soldiers during the 1939 to 1940 Winter War, and the fact that the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, there's a tendency to believe that the Russian military was a badly run and worse-equipped rabble. They were given inferior weapons compared to the Western powers at all times, and it was only sheer numerical advantage and a suicidal devotion to country that were able to defeat the Nazis and keep control of numerous satellite countries. Here at TopTenz, though, we happen to know better. Through much of its history, Russia hasn't merely had large ranks of dedicated fighters, it's possessed cutting-edge weaponry that has put its arrogant rivals to shame and struck fear in the hearts of conquered people that might otherwise revolt. Woe be to any enemy that has to face soldiers that possessed the weapons that we're looking at in today's video. Number 10. Katyusha rocket launcher. In June of 1941, when the Third Reich invaded, only 40 of these had been built by the Soviet Union. By 1943, though, that's just 2 years later, 3,237 of them were in service. So a collection of angled rocket platforms might sound ridiculously inefficient, but it was actually the fact that they used platforms instead of precisely calibrated artillery barrels that these weapons were so darn economical. Being relatively light, it was also much easier for them to be repositioned between volleys, so that the Reich artillery found it harder to get a bead on them when they returned fire. Indeed, they also had a maximum range of about 6 miles. Despite being woefully inadequate in terms of precision aiming, they were particularly unnerving for the Wehrmacht troops, who gave them the nickname Stalin's organ. Number 9. T-34 medium tanks. World War II buffs are often more familiar with the German Panzer or Tiger tanks, but early in the war, all Wehrmacht models paled before this medium tank, the weapon which was credited with saving Moscow from Operation Barbarossa. Heavily armored but with their weight evenly dispersed, early Reich anti-tank shells, both from their own armored vehicles and artillery, simply bounced off as these tanks drove nimbly over mud that heavier German tanks got bogged down in. It would take years before the Germans began to employ artillery shells against them, i.e. the infamous 88mm that could pierce their armor. Instead, more Russian casualties were suffered as a result of initially inadequate training than because of enemy firepower. The Red Army began the war with only 1,000 of these tanks, but by the time they saved Moscow, there were 2,800 of them built. Over the course of the entire war, though, there would be tens of thousands of them built. For a time, Hitler actually used these tanks to gloat over his advisors. After all, he had demanded heavier tank armaments, and here came the Soviets with exactly the type of weapon he wanted that were absolutely pounding his armored divisions. The Wehrmacht actually distributed propaganda to their own tank crews, which openly stated that the T-35 had been the best tank in the world. So much for supposed Germanic superiority on that one, eh? Number 8. The Mosin-Nagant Rifle. The sniper rifle of choice for the Red Army during World War II, even during the early days of the war, when routes by the Wehrmacht were the order of the day, snipers wielding this weapon gave the German army some grievous casualties. As National Interest reports, a single ambush in September of 1941 resulted in a handful of snipers inflicting 75 casualties on one German infantry regiment. This was a hard-won lesson for the Soviets, considering that it was the very weapon that SEMO, the White Death Higher, used to kill 542 of their own soldiers in 1939 to 1940. However, it was so invaluable to the USSR that Field and Stream reports a staggering 80% of all firearm casualties inflicted on German soldiers were through the use of this weapon. Number 7. Baltic Sea's chemical weapons. No one has more cause to fear these weapons than the Russians themselves and their Baltic neighbors. Although they were never used against the Axis powers during World War II, the Soviet Union built an arsenal of 15,000 tons of chemical weapons, among them sulfur mustard in artillery shells. When the war finished, the Soviet Union simply dumped all of these weapons into the Baltic Sea. Similar acts were done by Great Britain and the United States of America, but they had requirements that the dumping had to be in waters more than a kilometer deep. The problem was the Russians decided to dump theirs in the Baltic Baltic Sea, which has an average depth of only 150 meters, which is seriously shallow. Indeed, it should really be noted that commercially important fish can swim as deep as 150 meters. There have also been reports of Polish fishermen that have suffered the results of mustard gas poisoning from handling poisons that leaked from these discarded weapons. Further, Smithsonian Magazine reported in 2016 that many cod caught near dumping sites in the Baltic Sea were showing illnesses and developing problems that indicated the leaked chemicals were adversely affecting them. This was bad tidings for the customers of fish that was caught in these areas. Now, do keep this in mind here because we are very shortly going to be returning to the matter of Russian chemical weapons. Number 6. M240 mobile howitzers. In the days of drones and similar military technology, artillery pieces may seem hopelessly outdated as actually practical weapons. The Russian military and its clients, however, continue to use them to devastating effect on targets both military and civilian. It fires 221-pound, 1.5-meter-long shells, which are twice the size of the largest mortar in service in the United States Armed Forces, by the way. These shells are loaded by crews of 9 people at a rate of 1 round per minute. Targets have included Israeli fortifications during the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War, as well as strongholds for terrorists in Afghanistan and Beirut. During Russia's second war with Chechnya from 1999 to 2000, cities such as Grozny were particularly devastated by this weapon. More recently, it was one of the weapons of choice for Bashar al-Assad to wreck the city of Homs. Number 5. The deadliest submarine of World War II. While most of our other entries have focused on entire makes and models of weapons, for this one we're focusing on a single vessel. In fact, we're focusing primarily on a single attack, a chilling one even by the cruel standards of the Eastern Front. On October 30th, 1945, the Kriegsmarine ship Wilhelm Gustloff took off from the Gulf of Danzig with 10,000 refugees that were bound for the relative safety of Kiel, Germany. However, the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko, intercepted the massively overloaded vessel. It fired 4 torpedoes, one of which jammed in the torpedo tube and very nearly sank the submarine itself. Wilhelm Gustloff was struck by 3 torpedoes, one of which caused an explosion in the engine room that cut all power, plunging the ship into darkness as it sank over the next 90 minutes without even being able to send a distress message. 9,000 of the 10,000 people on board perished. And we must note here that this was a ship that contained 5,000 children. Despite the grim nature of the torpedo attack, S-13 became a venerated vessel. Captain Marisenko was named a hero of the Soviet Union. The vehicle itself was later included on postage stamps. It just goes to show how furious the population of the Soviet Union was that the deaths of thousands of children would be considered worth celebrating. Apparently, not all stories of heroes are heartwarming. Number 4. K-278 nuclear submarine. If there's something that's more frightening than a nuclear weapon held by a belligerent but ultimately rational nation, it's a nuclear weapon that could be in anyone's hands. That's the liability that was created by this submarine, specifically the disaster that befell it. Launched on May 30th, 1983, K-278 was an experimental double-hulled submarine and part of a line of prototypes called the Komsomolet, member of the Soviet Youth. Able to descend to an incredible 3,346 feet, it was functional at depths more than double those of the deepest diving American submarines and well below where American torpedo systems functioned. However, in 1989, while operating in the Norwegian Sea, a fire broke out in the aft section and the crew spent the next 6 hours attempting to fight it. But since a major air supply valve was feeding it, the effort was hopeless. In the evacuation, roughly 2/3 of the crew perished, mostly from the cold water while waiting to be rescued. The submarine, with its arsenal of 2 nuclear missiles, ended up at a depth of 5,250 feet. It wasn't until 1998 that the Russian government claimed it had fully closed off the submarine through several expeditions. But there were 2 ominous aspects to that. The first was that the submarine was located over a major fishing route, which was reminiscent of the chemical weapon dumps in the Baltic Sea. The other was that it was claimed that there was evidence of unauthorized visits to the submarine crash site by foreign agents. The simple possibility that nuclear weapons could have fallen into the hands of even a non-governmental group is quite chilling, even if that didn't quite happen. Number 3. 40,000 tons of chemical weaponry. Despite signing the Geneva Convention in 1960, which bans the production of chemical weapons, and deciding to dump their massive World War II produced supply in the Baltic Sea, by 2017, Russia had produced 40,000 tons of chemical weapons. The United States of America is also similarly guilty, so in 1993 they decided that they would sign an agreement to dispose of their weapons, and both they utterly failed to meet repeated delayed deadlines. The Russian government claimed in September of 2017 that they had finally destroyed all their shells of sarin gas, soman gas, mustard gas, and so forth, leaving only 1% of all forms of chemical weapons to be dealt with. Well, what would normally be a cause of celebration became significantly more uncertain when on April 4th, 2017, 80 Syrian people were killed in what evidence indicated was a chemical weapons attack by Bashar al-Assad. How much of a role Russia's chemical weapons stockpile played in this left nations around the world concerned, since Vladimir Putin had already been belligerent in occupying Ukraine in 2014 and his later actions in Syria. Russia also vetoed chemical weapon probe extensions by the United Nations. Whatever the truth in this matter is, it's hard to deny that Russia had a point when it was noted that the American military had missed more deadlines in destroying their own chemical weapons stockpile. Number 2. RS-28, Sarmat nuclear missile. When NATO dubs a nuclear weapon Satan II, you can understand anyone feeling a bit uneasy about the fact it's part of a launching system that will allow it to be fired anywhere on Earth. The RS-28 is a weapon that began development in 2011 and it's expected to be put into active service in 2018. It is stated to weigh 100 metric tons with a range of 6,200 miles. More importantly, it's also supposedly fitted with cutting-edge stealth technology, so targets will hardly be able to see it coming. Not that there's exactly much the other nations could do about it, depending on their size, of course. According to the Russian military, the nuclear detonation of this weapon is so extreme that it was said that a single missile could destroy all of France, or, as they more pointedly claimed, Texas. It remains unlikely that it will ever be fired, but ask yourself, can you really say stranger things haven't happened? Number 1. Explosives disguised as toys. Between 1979 and 1988, 13,000 Soviet troops would be killed in the invasion of Afghanistan, and more than 33,000 would be wounded, losses which would compel the Soviet military to turn to truly heinous weapons as part of tactics that could only reasonably be described as terrorism. As the New York Times reported in 1985, the UN's Commission on Human Rights has found that the occupying forces were leaving piles of objects which would be desirable to children in villages. These included matchboxes, hollow radios, harmonicas, and most notably toy birds with switches embedded in the wings. Like most mines, the intent was not actually to kill the children, but to grievously wound them with severed limbs, which would remind everyone who saw them for years after how high the costs were of incurring the Soviet army's wrath. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. And also, if you're looking for something else to watch right now, do check out some videos from the archives that are over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.